You wouldn't happen to know Sarah, would you? In 1993, Street Fighter II The New Challengers released with 4 new characters: T-Hawk, Fei Long, DJ, and Cammy. Along with those characters, however, came some stray, unused files. Based on the font the name used, it would have been used at character select as well as hovering under the health bar. It could have been a new character. Now, naturally, it's assumed this likely isn't pointing to a character we never got. During development at some point, Cammy was probably called Sarah. On top of being the only other female character introduced in this game, she also has some unfinished sprites for an attack that goes unused left in the files. For Cammy, it points to the possibility that she was the character who was going through the most tweaks prior to release. But for Sarah, it means that whatever was left of her, whether it be a whole character or merely a sprite and name, they'd only ever exist on the cutting room floor. A place for the unused and unplayable, and unfortunately, where most assets in games end up. Within the tens of gigabytes that make up your games are files upon files of creations that are hiding within its folders. Work completed that might have just taken a couple of minutes, a couple of hours, a couple of months. Any myriad of reasons for being on the cutting room floor is a mystery unique to every asset. But due to the nature of games, it's exceptional if anything found there is stable, let alone playable. You might not remember Rising Thunder. Only being playable through official servers for a year, it was a project that came and went quick like a flashbang, or Avril Lavigne's cultural relevance. It wasn't developed by Capcom or NetherRealm, no big name to immediately get the ball rolling, but it had big ideas, and even bigger robots, or at least they were for 2015. The one people remember was one-button specials on cooldowns, taboo even today and even more taboo for the time, but there were a bunch of smaller things that people seem to have forgotten about it. Matches were set up as actual first to 2 sets, characters had interchangeable moves, the meter system let you choose between an FADC that could cancel Matt Hancock, but like, properly this time, and Guilty Gear Burst without the social stigma that comes with playing an anime fighter. A lot of interesting ideas, and maybe it would have been too many for anyone to give it a shot if there weren't some particularly interesting people behind the project, so long as you were deep in the fighting game trenches. While Radiant Entertainment had never developed a fighting game, their staff comprised of 3 of the 4 EVO co-founders, Tom Cannon, Tony Cannon, and Seth Killian. 2 of which were tag team developers on GGPO, a networking system that made fighting games almost bearable online, and the other being an actual fighting game character, and also maybe he worked at Capcom or whatever. Between their contributions to fighting games, they built a strong rapport that encouraged people to go into Rising Thunder with excitement and an open mind, all coagulating into a well-received first impression. It feels good, plenty of potential, it's stylish, pretty, and fun to watch. What little coverage this game got was only positive, even with its potentially contentious systems and a small cast of only 6 characters. What it lacked in size though, it made up for plenty in variety. Although you had the common polar opposite with the big body grappler Talos to the slippery Zona shell, that was effectively the only trope to be found. Crow was all about pinning you to where you stand, with invisibility to keep your opponent guessing and a projectile that denied any opportunity to worm your way out of a knockdown. Dauntless might have seemed like a mindless bruiser, but she was full of tricks and resets to keep your opponent wondering what, when, or even if the next mix-up was coming. Edge exists, and somehow they digitized one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse with Vlad. For what is a humble gamer's defensive wheat field to a swarm of unseeable 50-50 locust. Through the characters and the systems, Rising Thunder was a very interesting game. Not everyone's cup of coffee, but then again, like McDonald's said, it's not my fault you can't handle the heat, hold this. Ooh, better luck next time. There was just one large, looming problem for this game. It was only online. There was no local play, and without logging in, you were even barred from training mode. If the servers ever went down, Rising Thunder was going with them. On March 8th, 2016, not even 12 months after Rising Thunder was let loose onto people's hard drives, Radiant announced that they had been acquired by Riot Games. The game was ceasing development, and in only 10 days, the servers were going offline. With little resistance, the files that built this game were about to mold and rot, wasting away the space of the hard drives that housed them. Not even a tweet could buy as they were being sent to their grave. But there were a handful who weren't happy with that ending. They wanted Rising Thunder to live on, because files do not rot. They are not wood, they're electricity. Maybe. So they took what they had and started to hack away at it. At first it was just looking at what they had left. Then it became cracking the login screen to get into the training mode, which they succeeded in doing. And as they were attempting to reverse engineer the servers so they could play online again, Radiant was about to intervene with a helping hand. It wasn't huge. They weren't gearing up to dev again, but they were ready to keep the game alive. In 2017, through Reddit of all places, they announced they were going to give more of the keys to the community so they could keep the game going on their own terms. They'd made incredibly minor changes to the final game build to get it working offline with local play, but we're talking incredibly minor. Don't expect new systems, don't expect new characters. The game only supports keyboard and controller offline, for God's sake. Whatever was left of the team was making it clear that this version of the game was identical to the version people were playing when the game shut down its servers over a year ago. That, however, was all anyone needed. And though it was a slapdash re-release, a download link through a Google Drive posted on a Reddit thread, Radiant kept good on their promise. And in January of 2018, the community would have all they needed to keep Rising Thunder alive forever. This video is not about Rising Thunder though. At least, it's not about the story of what it was. See, as 2018 turned 2019, which turned 2020, the community was dwindling. It's hard to keep a game alive and exciting through Discord and a download on Reddit. So as the player base started to decline, old habits started to resurface. If you can't find a game, you might as well tinker with what you have. The issue with that though is Rising Thunder, even more so than most games, is a tangled mess. It's effectively impossible to add new things to the game, just activate and deactivate things that are already within its files. And what one user was about to find, buried in folders of folders, was about to forever change this small roster size of 6. Or was it 8? Inside the characters folder there were the 6 robots you'd expect, however with them came 2 additional folders, named Kart 07 and 08. These weren't empty though, they're full of data that once activated. Nearly 5 years after Rising Thunder shut down, it just got 2 new characters. Aegis, a shield-driven brick wall who's destined to end up at advantage in your face, and Gun, the tin of beans with 1 ingredient. These 2 characters are worlds apart. Gun's inspired by the conventions of fighting games adolescence, showing reflections of guile in his design, while Aegis is something completely fresh. Less identifiable in inspiration, her gameplay was unique, and as a result is much less immediately understandable from the perspective of game plan. When she says she's not like the other girls, she means it. Or at least, that's what I'd imagine she'd say if she had any voice acting. Although the community had just found 2 new characters, they were both unfinished to varying degrees. Aegis was clearly just born a little early. She's missing voice acting, doesn't have a unique super or introduction, and is anemic in swappable moves. Meanwhile, Gun's basically missing everything. Almost every attack is shared, he doesn't have any interchangeable moves, and even his original elements weren't exactly cleanly implemented. Gun feels more like a doodle on Radiant's whiteboard, right next to a crudely drawn guile. Not so much born early, but instead still an idea of pregnancy in one of the cannons, which is a visual I'm not going to make in fear of it being deemed harassment. Despite missing elements though, the players of Rising Thunder were undeniably excited. Even if they weren't finished, they weren't broken. They didn't cause crashes, they didn't have infinites, they were just new, unique characters. For any game, this would have been a once-in-a-lifetime spark to drive up hype, let alone in a game that hadn't had an update in 4 years. Naturally, the player base accepted them for what they were, and immediately they were embraced in the newly discovered cast of 8. Such an insane discovery wasn't just huge for Rising Thunder, this should have sent shockwaves through every gaming news outlet as one of the most freakishly playable discoveries in gaming archival history. And yet, that excitement went unheard. There is not one single article about this discovery. Rock Paper Shotgun, PC Gamer, Kotaku, not even Dexerto, and these dickheads think some random's ranked Apex game is news. Nobody was talking about this. Even on YouTube, there are 2 videos about these characters. While they might be decently documented inside of the game's Discord, you, right now, might be looking at the least known fighting game characters ever, which I think is a damn shame for Aegis. Even though some of the appeal of Aegis definitely comes from the fact that her existence is an anomaly, she's got value beyond that in how damn unique she is. She's not explosive, not a surprise can of infinite mix, she's not got the projectiles to put her in the new armored core. She is unassuming. Simple sweeps and normals create an observable surface that's unremarkable. Peel back just a couple of those layers though, and that simple exterior reveals an immovable tank in both the good and also, oh, you can hardly move, the bad. Aegis has a mobility problem. She's got the worst dash in the game and an abysmal walk speed that forces her to hold ground whether she likes it or not. It causes her to be vulnerable to projectiles in a game where most characters would consider them trivial, and doesn't provide her the opportunity to use mobility to reposition herself from a bad spot. A glaring flaw, I'm sure you can tell, but it's also built into the very core of her design philosophy, counterbalanced by the fact that she has some absurd buttons that lets her hold ground and bully players once she's in. That's not with unfathomable mix-up or deathly coin tosses, but with a little system called frame advantage. For those uninitiated in the fighting game pyramid scheme, frame advantage is the difference in time between when you and your opponent can act after a hit. If you're going to act first, you're plus however many frames you are ahead, and if you're going to act second, you are minus however many frames. It determines who comes out at advantage on individual attacks. So for example, here Aegis is plus. She's also plus on close heavy. However, after a special 1, she's clearly in a position to be plus. Guess what this is? The property combination of extremely poor mobility and incredibly strong frame advantage makes her a particularly interesting spin-off of the high-risk, high-reward gameplay that you find in a lot of low mobility characters. The threat here isn't like that of the grappler, where you'd be in range to have a third or more of your life getting deleted. It's that as she gets closer, you are going to be put in scenarios where you have less and less agency in the right amount of choices you can make. If you're stupid enough to press here, you will be punished for it, and once that fear has been struck within the player and they start to shut down, that becomes the chance for the character to run a train on your psyche. Between using that as a chance to reset into more plus frames or push for the reward of a throw, time spent in Aegis's plus frame blender causes the right choice to slowly slip further and further away from the opponent. The mechanics of this, however, isn't inherently a unique concept to Aegis. This scenario where you take your frame advantage and force a punish if anyone dares to press is called a frame trap, where you trap them in... This isn't preschool, you get it. And I can't think of a fighting game that doesn't have an example of one, unless we're talking about games that are so old they go by unknown blocking logic, or like King of Fighters Pachinko. This is real, by the way, we live in hell. What is unique about Aegis though is one of her moves that can frame trap. Special 1, or Shield Rush, sets up for some of the most oppressive sequences I've ever seen in a fighting game. A 10 frame startup that leads to being +4 on block would be pretty good regardless of what the attack actually was. It gives you a degree of freedom and safety and offense that every character yearns for, but that's not what makes this move absurd, or at least, it's not its only anomaly. Shield Rush can be cancelled into Special 2, which turns this into a full launcher with the right resources and lets you set up for Special 3 on most characters. Being safe on block and a full launcher if it hits, That's pretty brainless. The button gets pressed and your job is to recognize if you're about to be rewarded or rewarded more. But don't worry, it gets dumber. Because this move being a special means that you can use it to special cancel. Some moves make sense to be special cancelled. Very reasonable cancel, just like Matt Hancock. That though, is a sweep. That's -10 on block. Unless it's +4. This attack takes any move and turns it into safety, letting the character steamroll offense. The risk associated with failing any grounded interaction simply doesn't exist, so long as the button, at some point, makes contact. To top it off, you can hold this move down, and thanks to a system called Proximity Block, if this move is out, you cannot walk backwards. This leaves your two movement options being backdashing or jumping. You get hit if you try to jump after a held block. This amalgamation of properties is excessive. It turns this attack into a kind of catch-all move that's only properly beaten out with a precise read. It's a brutal poke that doubles as an absurd frame trap, but it also makes sense. This character's motif surrounds a slow hulking powerhouse, and this move helps her to actually put that idea forward without having to be yet another SPD machine. She'll never immediately put you in danger, but she's more like the It Follows horror of a slowly creeping, inescapable presence. Something that's both hard to find in other fighting games, and also makes her fit in a cast of other unique characters, which I think is what makes Gun as odd as he is. Although you could lazily gesture shell towards a Shoto-shaped hole, it'd be hard to identify what character she's specifically based on. She's more a picking of defensive Shotos that makes her any of them and none of them at the same time. The same can be said for Talos. To argue that he's not a grappler would be a sign that the lobotomy required to play the character type had some critical errors, but try and pin him down to any direct influence and you'll be struggling. You could argue that he's based on Potemkin at a stretch, but you could make just as many arguments that he's inspired by Daimon, or any other character that you've never cared to remember the name of. They're certainly characters of their cliche, but Rising Thunder isn't a game of direct copycats, which makes Gun pretty odd, or at least what's left of him. Gun is the most underdeveloped character, which you can see almost immediately. If that's not by the fact that the thing in his name is almost never properly animated, it's by the fact that those animations aren't even his. RoboGuile here is using a lot of moves as placeholders, and without one of the developers on the project telling us, wink wink, it's impossible to tell if these were moves that were closest to what was intended for the character, or just something to pad out the command list for playtesting. What is original to him though are the building blocks to one of fighting game's most iconic characters. Having two moves be tied to the same resource might not be exclusively Guile-esque, but when you're putting in Street Fighter 2 Shoto kills, you might as well just put the hair on him. Much like Guile, that should theoretically push him towards a game plan all about controlling mid-screen and creating a hard-to-approach turtle. Something that's almost always at least good, if not great. So let's have a look at the tier list and oh no. Whether or not you think a character is good ultimately comes down to perception, but considering the small community of players widely considers him the worst character in the game, you should probably consider that a sign that he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. The fireballs are fine individually. You can even do this cool thing where you hold a fireball so you can get a second fireball trailing behind it. That's neat. The issue is they don't provide the pushback necessary to let you move your opponent into the ideal spacing. Getting people into a range where the fireball DP wall is actually threatening relies on the opponent consistently putting themselves in it rather than being forced into it. That leads to you needing to find the ideal scenario as opposed to making it, which doesn't really ever let you take control of the match. Not to mention how the latter part of the fireball DP wall doesn't really work. Whenever DP is pressed, the cooldown is much longer than the fireball reset, so to cover the air once means giving up your only good air coverage tool for so long that the opponent can effectively jump in uncontested. It makes his main game plan prone to some pretty fundamental flaws. Not a problem if he could rely on other options, but all of his tools are unreliable in different ways. This ground bouncing anti-air overhead could be pretty damn exceptional, but as an anti-air it's got a bit too much startup to be used outside of a read, and as an overhead, It doesn't. This is the most overhead coded move I've ever seen in my life. Why does it not hit crouching? His main combo opener is close light, but you have to be at point blank range to make it work for the payout of a Victorian chimney sweep. It can be improved with some bar and this move, but remember, they need to be standing, and none of your combos restand, so oops. With a game plan that doesn't fit within the game's systems, and tools that are technically consistent but practically unreliable, he's a character that just feels like he doesn't belong here. But that's also kind of what the few people that know of his existence like about him. Sure, he's unapologetically Guile, but that doesn't mean he's good at being him. Everything about him hardly works, even his combo routes that are pretty cool, which makes him fall apart in ways that are just kind of funny. He has to be smarter and work harder for less reward than everyone else in the cast. So when you win, you really know you won and weren't just carried by knowledge checks and strong buttons. A pretty stark contrast to the cellmate that he roomed with for 5 years. Aegis can get away with bullying you with a game plan full of gimmicks. You might not be able to knowledge check when the 5 people still playing know exactly what the character can do, but the amount of options she has into and off of this one button makes her game plan solid from the word. Oh yeah, no voice acting. I'm sure that's not stopped you from whipping up a little game plan built around that poor mobility though. Having not played against this character, or Rising Thunder for the last 7 years, all you need to do is jump over her. I don't see the big deal. Welcome to hell, where infinite unwinnable scenarios and even more pachinko awaits. Aegis has the best anti-air normal in the game, an anti-air reversal of such unknowable horror it's got H.P. Lovecraft rolling in his grave seeking comfort from his racist cat, along with the best air-to-airs, which doubles as one of the best don't walk up to me moves in the game. Fast to come out, ambiguous on timing thanks to being a hold, and nearly impossible to punish, you will not know its purpose until you've either been hit by it or forced to turtle because of it. Welcome to Schrodinger's normal. The no-fly zone that all these moves develops makes Aegis more than just an offensive steamroller. She's a defensive powerhouse, not because she can deny you the opportunity to walk up, but because she'll put you through the ground for trying to claw your way into her space. Once you're there, she pops special 3, and finally that shield aesthetic becomes a shield problem. While nothing seems wrong at first, you now need to play the next interaction to lose less, rather than win more. Special 3 has 2 variations, both of which imbue your attacks with new properties. One increases the amount of grey life your attacks do on block. Honkshoe, I agree, nobody uses it. The other is a mechanic I've never seen replicated. Once the animation completes, you are now buffed, and any of your next 2 attacks now have armor. I feel like I don't have to explain the strength of I can take this button that's already insane and make it uncontestable. You don't have to play the game to understand that. But that's not the real strength of this move. Instead, it's about using that armor to take your biggest weakness and borderline remove it. Jumping is one of the fastest ways for Aegis to approach, which under most circumstances is a bad idea because of how the fixed jump arc and a lack of defensive options leaves you predictably open to anti-airs. With armor though, when she jumps, she has all of the control. Suddenly the slow, plodding steamroller just got a jet engine installed, and its destination is set to your block. She's still plus there, by the way. This is the kind of strong female character that gets the trad male playing Bethesda games riled up. A solid game plan, great tools, and genuine flaws that are built into the core of a character designed around striking fear into your opponent. There's a contradiction here, more so in Aegis, but also in Gun, of this completed vision of what the character should have been that isn't matched by where they are from a development standpoint. Aegis is bullish in a way that's completely fresh for a game that thrives in its close quarters play. And even if Gun is just Guile, but here, he's got a goal of controlling mid-screen in a way that's unique to this game that makes him valuable to the whole that Rising Thunder has become. They're both incredible discoveries for this game, and it's an immense shame that neither of them ever crossed the finish line. But were either of them ever actually close to getting there? Let's dive a little deeper into those missing elements, because there's only so much you can see from what you can play. Aegis obviously has more going on than Gun, but looking through the files reveals more clearly just how large that disparity is. You might have noticed that both of these characters look distinctly different from their finished counterparts. Although they have materials assigned to them, neither of them have any textures. Sort of. When extracted using a program called UE Viewer, Aegis comes with a lot of unused textures. 2 sets of diffuse maps, an emission map, normal map, roughness map, and a metallic map, which is the standard for most finished characters, bar any props that might come with them. Meanwhile, Gun is missing all of those files, additionally missing any .map files that might point to images that are going to be associated with the characters, that might indicate if he did or did not have any finished textures to go along with him. This, on top of a lack of unique animations, implies that between the 2 characters, Aegis was likely in active development, pushing towards the finished product, while Gun was still in an extremely experimental phase, and if given more time could have ended up being a completely different character or a scrapped failed experiment. That said, you might have noticed that Aegis isn't using any of those textures, reason being that when you attempt to apply them, that's not what it's supposed to look like. The UV map that determines what section of an image is projected to a surface for both of these characters either exports incorrectly or is just legitimately broken. The solution for Aegis might seem simple. It would be tedious, but you could remap the model by hand. Looking at the textures provided, however, brings me to a different issue. I can't confirm this, but I'm pretty confident that the textures that we have here aren't for this version of Aegis. Although you can reasonably fit certain parts of the model onto the diffuse map, the visor doesn't align at all, and if this isn't the visor, then what is? While I'd love to sit here and have a guess at what part of this image is supposed to make what part of this model, it's much more likely that the model we have is an altered version of the one that this diffuse map is for. That said though, it's impossible to 100% confirm the textures that we have are even for Aegis. When extracted, Aegis's model is named ch_08, but all of these files are for a def bot. Now, because of the shield aesthetic and parts of the model that do align, we can reasonably assume that these 2 are connected, but in doing so, it reveals that these assets that have been recovered from the cutting room floor have additional unused assets that are definitely lost. That's not even to mention the unused files that we can see. Aegis has files for a sword that never goes used, and the .map file points towards a texture we don't have. Why is all this stuff in the corner? There's these files for a VFX called Shield Spin and Spin Back. Maybe that implies that Aegis might have at one point played like Captain America. Maybe it was a Special 1 variation that just never got used. Despite the fact that the Aegis we can play seems fully realized, if we dig a little deeper, it's clear that she wasn't entirely fully formed. The team was likely pretty confident in the character she was supposed to be, but still far enough away that she wasn't near presentable. Not in the same way as Gun. He was clearly far away from release, but Aegis could have been anywhere, from just a couple of weeks away or months down the pipeline. It leaves a lot of uncertainty between what these characters are and what these characters were supposed to be. One of the only things that we know for certain though is that they were always supposed to end up in the game at some point. The version of the game that we've been looking at is the 2018 Community Edition release, but the initial 2015 release is also set up to accommodate the characters. The same files can't be found between both versions, but the structure for the characters to exist are. There's a folder called Face that houses a lone model of Shell, Gun's closest counterpart, and another folder called Deathbot. All that can be extracted from this is a repeated model of Dauntless, but it shows to me that Rising Thunder was a game that was supposed to be much larger than what we have today, and I don't think there was ever any intention of it being left to us the way that it currently is. When Rising Thunder first became playable in 2015, it was released in alpha, the game that we got being representative of what we could expect, but not everything we could expect. If it had picked up any sense of steam and attention, maybe we would have seen that. But unfortunately, it seemed there just wasn't enough value to keep the game going. In 2016, when Rising Thunder was taken offline, Radiant was actually developing 2 games, the one you're now hopefully familiar with, and Stonehearth. This was a crowdfunded game that even after Radiant's acquisition, continued development until 2018. Maybe it's the crowdfunding that kept the game going for as long as it did, a sense to fulfill the promises that they'd put forward to the people they'd seeked funding from. But it's clear that there was something different between this and Rising Thunder as a project, and a part of me suspects a lack of popularity. The game was only available for PC, which was a platform that not many in the FGC were playing on at the time, and even though it was free, there wasn't any way to pay for anything in the game, so it was a cost to keep this game running for what was likely an extremely niche community. That positive early response that I showed wasn't just from any articles about this game, it was from some of the only articles. Rising Thunder just wasn't catching on, so maybe even without Riot's acquisition in 2016, we'd still only have the game that we currently have. With Rising Thunder's Reddit release is an even more overlooked release of development footage and concept art. While you'd naturally be correct in assuming that this contains the characters of the base roster in varying incomplete forms, most of the concept art, it's these two. Not in the way that we know them, concepts on concepts of stuff that we never saw, most likely just experiments, but doesn't it seem a little odd to you that most of the concept art was for two characters that were in the files that couldn't be seen? Maybe this is a mad conspiracy theory. After all, the Reddit thread posted by Inkblot, which is Tom Cannon, specifically said don't expect new characters, but it almost feels like the community was always supposed to find these two. Like this was the last hurrah before years of work from a passionate team became just another project left unfinished. Whatever it was, whether we got these characters by intention or not, to me they're representative of a game that never got its opportunity to shine. Sure, maybe it was playable. People know it exists, which is a lot more than most games, but there's still so much we don't know about this game. We don't even really know who worked on it. Tom, Tony, and Seth, sure, but this isn't the work of 3 people. It's a miracle these characters are playable, but they weren't characters made by accident. There would have been a team behind this, along with all this concept art, all this stuff. This isn't indicative of a game that was supposed to live on for a year. And who the hell's this? There's concept art named Scarfbot. There's no folders or files under that name. And all of this, the thousands of hours of ambition, work put in and work planned, it's all been swallowed by the cutting room floor. Maybe that's the inevitable resting place for everything. With download links and server structure, we can't keep every file going forever, no matter how much work might have gone into its creation. The Rising Thunder Discord is keeping the game active for now, though it's impossible to know how long that could be sustained. So play these characters while you can, before they're, once again, fighters lost in the files.